morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Greetings from Singapore. My name is Lauren Sorkin from the Global Resilient Cities Network, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 11th Cities on the Front Line COVID-19 Coronavirus Speaker Series, Sharing Knowledge to Respond with Resilience. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have very qualified speakers who are going to share with us how we move towards a pandemic resilient city, both in the short term, as well as what we need to do to be prepared using data, using scenarios. And then we are very fortunate to have another speaker who's going to give us a frontline view from cities. Before I turn the microphone over to Francis from the World Bank to introduce our speakers, I want to remind everyone of the purposes of these sessions. These sessions are designed for practitioners. They are for learning. They are for cities and the partners who are interested in helping them to respond and recover with resilience from the coronavirus. In that vein, these are honest and open learning conversations, and we ask that should you want to quote any of the speakers, you please reach out to us so that we can check that with them before publishing anything in the media. Also, we are very pleased to note that there are over 600 people from around the world registered to join us tonight. So during the question and answer session, we ask that you use the Q&A function. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen, and type your question into that Q&A space so that we can draw from those questions during that part of the speaker series this evening. And with that, I also want to thank, as always, our co-host from the World Bank and turn the floor and the microphone over to Francis.
Thank you, Lauren. My name is Francis Guestière. I first would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the World Bank City Resilience Program. This week, we have the first of a series of talks on how cities could gradually lift some of the current quarantine restriction imposed in view of COVID-19 and then restart their economy while keeping citizens safe. I suspect we'll have quite a few sessions on that topic because we're all interested personally and for the that we support. We'll have three speakers tonight or today. Robert Muir-Wood, Chief Resilience Officer at Risk Management Solutions, RMS, Daniel Standard, Global Managing Director also at RMS, and then Mahesh Harhare, Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Pune, who's going to give us a bit more of a city perspective or an on-the-ground perspective. They have organized a presentation to give to discuss first possible strategies for the short term, and then discuss ideas for the longer term. They will alternate among the three speakers, and together I think they will use about 40 minutes. We will then open for question, and again, please use the Q&A function in the WebEx to ask your question. Without further ado, let me turn on to my good friend Robert to start the presentation. Robert, the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Muir-Wood. I'm the Chief Research Officer from Risk Management Solutions, a risk and catastrophe modeling company. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Daniel Stander. So what can we bring from a risk modeling perspective to questions of urban resilience around pandemics? We remain in the middle of the pandemic, like a coastal town in the middle of a hurricane. The pandemic has months, even years to run, but we are beginning to see through to the other side. So today we're going to focus on two key timeframes, the next 3 months and the next 3 years. For the next 3 months, we will be focusing on reopening economies and activities while trying to prevent a resurgence in infections. Looking out 3 years, we have the opportunity to embed actions that will make our world and our cities more resilient in the face of future or recurrent outbreaks of infectious diseases. In most countries, we have been fighting the COVID-19 pandemic with ancient techniques that go back hundreds of years, like imposing quarantine on those potentially sick, which is at least 600 years old, or containment of those already ill, or social distancing, which goes back at least 400 years. and the protective sequestration of those who choose not to be exposed at all. From our risk modeling perspective, we want to turn this into a data and action problem, identify the appropriate metrics, and take measurements from which we can then take the effective actions. Next slide, please. Underlying all this is an understanding of the progression of the COVID-19 infection that we capture in the R value, the transmission or reproductive number. The R value is a compound of the infection and the human world in which it spreads. The virus takes advantage of our sociability. If someone is infectious for 5 days, then with an R value of 1.5, we double the number of cases every 6 days, with 5 cases after 3 weeks. With an R value of 3.5, at the upper end of what was suggested at the start of COVID-19, we double every 3 days, and after 3 weeks, we'll have 150 cases, 30 times more. Next slide, please. So the simplest way to reduce the R value is to make it harder to infect one another through getting people to stay at home and not meet with one another in social distancing. Next slide, please. And Daniel, if I could hand over to you.
And when Robert's talking about the infection rate and the mortality rate and getting your arms around that and understanding how different interventions, whether they be or whether you want to gradually reopen the economy, or interventions around vaccines or interventions around pharmaceutical treatments, it's important to be able to measure on a rolling basis every day, every week, what those different interventions are likely to be able to affect for you in terms of reducing hospitalizations, reducing ICU capacity, or indeed restarting the economy. And these kinds of metrics are the kinds of metrics that at a national level and at a city level we're beginning to see used by what we would describe as best practice municipalities to get ahead of what's coming. Robert, back over to you.
Okay, thank you. So next slide, please. Once the virus has spread, the R value will vary from city to country, from region to region. We need to map the R value as close to real time as possible and always try to keep it under that magic number of 1, which means the infection rate is reducing. Real time is a challenge. We cannot wait for hospital admissions because that responds to the R value of 2 to 3 weeks earlier. We need to be performing large-scale surveying, monitoring trends, and seeing what they imply about a modeled R value. Social distancing is one way to reduce R. Another is contact tracing, identifying further cases and isolating them so they cannot infect further. As we plan to reopen sectors, we need to find how to translate between measures of human contact and their impact on the rate of infection. And this is the key component of what we propose. Underlying this translation is an understanding of how contact, in terms of distance between people and duration spent together, converts into infection. A plot of risk levels from an infected person might look something like this chart. To make it simpler, governments have turned this into a simple risk-based instruction, like keeping at least 2 meters distance for no more than 15 minutes. Next slide, please. We want to be able to measure the human contact in different activities, and we need a metric for doing this, like the time spent in a 24-hour period with another person within less than 2 meters separation between them. We need to define this metric, and we need to give it a name. I suggest it should be called huddle. Then we can measure how much huddle is involved in an office, in taking elevators, on a production line, on a subway, in buses, in bars or restaurants, or at a major sports event. And we need to see how these activities fit together. Like people going for work will take the subway and the elevator to get to their workplace, or people who work in a production line might take buses to get to their job, or even people going to a big sports event to be a spectator They may take a bus to get there, and then they may go to a bar afterwards. And we need to account for all of this contact time when we consider these different activities. So how do potential actions around social distancing reduce the huddle? Next slide, please. According to the percentage of people who are infectious, we can convert huddle into what is likely to mean for additional infections, and the shift in the R value introduced by opening up this particular sector. We can see why those high huddle activities like major sports events, in particular those with older spectators, will be the last to be switched back on. And when we convert between huddle and infectiousness, it is not just how long you are in someone else's close company, but also the number of people with whom you shared huddle. Consider the situation where two people who share a confined space as compared with the large number of different people who come close to the driver of a bus during the day, each for maybe only 10 seconds. If 1% of all the people are infectious, this can present a much higher risk for the bus driver than the room partner. Next slide, please. So if we can measure huddle and relate it to the number of new infections, we can also calculate how contacts and implied infections can be reduced through social distancing. Going back to first principles, we can begin to connect actions to increase human separation and predict the impact on the R value. And then we can include the economic and social benefits of reopening that factory or that activity and compare the costs in terms of increased infections with the benefits, both social and economic. Next slide, please. But the trade-offs can be complicated. Take the question of reopening schools. There are many factors to consider. Will there be additional infections among the children? Does that mean more infections among their teachers as well as in the children's and teachers' households? Closed schools affect their parents' work and incomes and thereby impact the economy. Closed schools disadvantage children, especially from poorer families. It may be possible to have greater spatial separation of children, but maybe not on school buses. However, if parents drive their children to school to avoid the buses, that will increase traffic. We could have more but smaller classes, but then the exposure for teachers does not change. One has to try to find an optimal course of action through these trade-offs. All will be dependent on the rate of infection. Next slide, please. I'm now going to hand over to Mahesh to consider these 3-month focus in his Chief Resilience Officer role in Pune. I have 4 questions for him. First, how do you negotiate your role alongside national public health agencies? Second, what data do you need to perform your role? Third, how do you balance the needs of managing infectious disease alongside other potential needs from other shocks and stresses? And lastly, what are the particular challenges of your city which make managing a pandemic unique? Over to you, Mahesh.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Welcome you all. I just give you background about Pune City. I will be talking about 2 important aspects which Robert talked about: the human contact, the huddle aspect, and the transmissibility aspect. So here we will look at the spatial data which city has used to basically understand how to respond to the COVID outbreak, and then how to take up some of the measures and strategies to basically tackle that and plan for future. So for many of you who don't know about Pune City, it's located in India, in the western part of India, in Maharashtra state. Population is around 5 million. It's similar to other Indian cities which are very populated. And then if you see, there are denser areas also within the city, which comprises of slums and squatter settlements, which comprise of almost 28% of city's population. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So this gives overall picture of Pune City. Although it's a scenic, there are issues also. Mobility is one of the major issue for Pune City. Next slide, please. I just go back one step and highlight the point that why data is very useful, especially the spatial mapping and use of that data. If you look at 2010 scenario where we had swine flu pandemic in India, that time Pune also suffered. Almost more than 140 casualties were there. And that time, although city had advanced in e-governance and data, but was not able to use it effectively. Then during 2019, there was a cloud burst and lot of flooding. These are two different incidences and different types of data, different types of modeling is required for these kind of catastrophes or disasters. And city tried to basically work around that. But I can say there were definitely challenges in terms of reliable data and effective use for analysis. But what happened next? Can you go to next slide? So in March, around 9th of March, we had first case of COVID in Pune. Then city started working on that, started responding on that. But this time it did differently than it did earlier, during earlier pandemics. City looked at different wards. Ward is a particular administrative area of a city. The entire city is divided into 15 wards. So city broke entire data into different wards to understand whether it's a local hotspot phenomenon or it's spreading uniformly across the city. And that was very useful, which city had done first time to basically address this kind of a pandemic. Next slide, please. So you can see a number of cases were identified across different wards, and the areas which are hotspot, especially with more than 20 cases were identified, which were around the central part of the city, old part of the city, and especially the high dense areas where Robert also highlighted the human contact point. So a lot of these areas have very smaller houses. There is no open space available in majority of the places, especially in the slums. So these are highly affected areas. And you can see other areas which are green and yellow, which are comparatively lesser affected. So city could draw conclusions based on this and could identify special areas which can be cordoned off. Next slide, please. So based on that, city started tracking each ward. So you can see yellow circles, which are the areas or the wards which are showing higher doubling rate compared to other parts of the city. So you can see these 4 circles, these areas comprise almost 70 to 80% of the total cases. With this kind of data and micro level granular data available, city could identify larger containment zones and micro containment zones so that they can use their resources, for example, health workers, the essential services, the police force effectively, and they can deploy them effectively. Next slide, please. You can see the overall journey and the data which we were talking about. Thankfully, all the data was available on a daily basis and city could track that. If you see the left-hand chart where which shows the number of tests city has conducted, it has grown substantially from a 900 per day basis to almost 1600, 1.5 times. At the same time, as Robert talked about the doubling and tripling rate, initially city had around 1st of May 100 cases, and then those were growing in the first week of May. But again, city could able to address that based on the information they had and adopting the containment zone strategy and also adopting the isolation strategy. Now, currently the cases are almost similar to what we had in the first week of May. So city could avoid the faster doubling of the cases. So that is a test case which shows that how data can be effectively used. Next slide, please. So this is a slide which is slightly busy slide, which shows how city evolved different strategies. So initially the response was more in terms of responsive, where city was testing only those cases which were coming up. Then they slowly started adopting a strategy where they started identifying high risk cases, which are the people who are indirect contact with the COVID positive patients. And then cities started addressing the asymptomatic cases also by looking at those granular areas or containment zone. City adopted mobile ambulances. They use those mobile ambulances to basically track the unknown or the asymptomatic people, and then they could able to refer almost 280 cases with help of that. And also it ensured that a city can have a proper strategy to supply essentials to different parts of the city, because majority of the people in the denser areas are from urban poor or slum settlements, which do not have access to these facilities. So that way it could manage the entire process, not only planning for containment, but also planning for essential services and effective lockdown. Then the city could have a lot of data, and the city used that data not only for their internal analysis. Pune Corporation used that data to basically communicate it to different stakeholders so that there is no confusion or miscommunication to the citizens, and that was able to build the trust between the city officials, the government, and citizens, that the amount of effort the city is putting in terms of containment and providing the essential services. I think that was really helpful. Over to you, Robert, for next section.
Okay, thank you, Mahesh. So we now want to broaden this perspective and actually start thinking about beyond the 3-month perspective towards a 3-year perspective. So 3 years. I mean, we are still in the middle of the infection, so we're looking out for a time when the issues from COVID-19 are still going to be hot, if you like. If we look out too far into the future, we'll find that people tend to forget. I mean, they tended to forget after the SARS infections in 2003 within a few years. So we need to make our actions focus on the time when this whole question of what happened and what we've learned is still a very live issue. So in 3 years' time, COVID-19 will still be out there, but many people will have been vaccinated, and along with actual cases and recoveries, I mean, I'm assuming a vaccine will have been safely delivered by then. There will be partial herd immunity when a significant number of people are in fact immune either because they have been previously infected or else they've been vaccinated. And that herd immunity keeps outbreaks largely under control. But in some parts of the world, there is still going to be endemic activity. Next slide, please. So one thing we will need to focus on as we are coming out of the pandemic is learning from the best performing countries with COVID-19. I mean, every country has tended to take its own actions, and there has been a lot of learning. A lot more learning needs to be done about what has been most exemplary. South Korea is one country which I think there's still much to learn from it. I mean, it had an infection of the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome MERS, another coronavirus, in 2015. And from that, and also from the earlier SARS outbreak, it learned a lot about actually how to manage a pandemic of this form. The public health agencies knew right from the start that exponential growth can only be managed by very rapid scaling of capabilities before the outbreak gets underway. So we saw that in South Korea in terms of dramatically expanding the capability for testing. We saw it in China for the hospital building program in Wuhan through January. So these are attempts to really get on top of a process of this exponential increase of the number of infections. So that there is much to be learned from. Even in South Korea, when the number of new cases reached almost 1,000 a day, the public health agency was still able to sustain contact tracing to identify further infections, contain them, and quarantine those who came into close contact. One feature of South Korea is that all the capability which they had developed as part of managing the outbreak of SARS and MERS, they had it available so they could bring it out again rapidly if and when a new pandemic arrives. And that's something that countries around the world are going to have to get to do. Next slide, please. We need to go much further in developing capabilities that reduce the risk and reduce the consequences of future pandemics. We need to get better. So we need to get better internationally at firefighting the first signs of a new pandemic at source while it is still possible to completely extinguish the blaze. That'll take a lot of thinking, a lot of work internationally to identify how to be able to act effectively and rapidly. We also need to get smart at using technology and architecture to make it possible to modify the functions of a city so that through a switch to social distancing, we can sustain the economy while managing a pandemic. Monitoring everyone every day. I mean, one could even see in the future that actually this testing could come down to testing at an individual level, that it's something one would do every day and report the results, that actually it could come down that everybody is participating. So, and quarantining those who have come into contact with the infectious, so the infection does not get the upper hand. So I can see, I mean, I think there's huge potential, huge room for solutions around architecture, the use of robots, the use of technology and self-administered health monitoring. But we should focus on the fact that every new disease is different. So every new disease has different infectiousness, different mortality age distribution, different symptoms, different treatment options. So we need to be very flexible and what we call probabilistic in our planning. For example, prior to COVID, some countries had only planned for an influenza pandemic. They hadn't planned for a coronavirus pandemic. We need to adopt what is called a no regrets strategy of action. So no regrets strategies are when you can't precisely forecast the future. So you need to plan for a wide range of possible pandemics rather than planning around a single scenario or just assuming the next outbreak will be a repeat of COVID-19. Then I believe that insurance can play a much greater role than has been the case with COVID-19. In offering compensation for businesses closed by the infection and those closed by the response to the infection, that will also require insurers collecting premium for something that may only happen once a century, for which, like a great earthquake, the memory will need to be kept alive through risk modeling. So those are some thoughts about the future. I think there's a wide-ranging agenda of topics and actions which we need to begin identifying and thinking through how these will be developed over the next few years, again, while the whole memory of this tragic pandemic is still very hot with us. So I'm now going to pass back again to Mahesh to get his thoughts and inputs on this 3-year time horizon. And I have for him 4 questions again. So the first one is, can you define in quantitative terms what pandemic resilience means for you? How do you assess whether your city has achieved some level of pandemic resilience going forward? Second, how can you keep the memory of what has happened with COVID-19 alive? We know with catastrophe risk more generally, we absolutely need to remind people about what has the potential to happen, because otherwise they tend to forget and then they're unprepared when that situation returns, whether that's a hurricane or whether it's a pandemic. Third, and this is related to this question, how can you keep actually, what are the most important takeaways for this whole question of long-term pandemic resilience? And lastly, how can you effectively campaign for legacy actions? It's going to take arguing for budgets, arguing for action when there will be so many other things on which there'll be a need to take a focus. So it will require very effective campaigning for legacy actions. Over to you, Mahesh.
Thank you, Robert. First, I will give you some background about how the the recovery happens in India. Typically, it's a 3-layered institutional structure. There is a government of India at the central level, then there is a state government, and then the district and city governments. That is how the flow is there. As far as the response was concerned, the guidelines were issued by Government of India, testing protocol, methodology, supply of kits. It was like a top-down approach where everything was managed by Government of India. In terms of the recovery packages also, many of the things are decided at the national level. Then some things are decided at the state level in consultation with Government of India, and then it is passed on to city and district level. So that's how the overall structure is. But still, the overall ecosystem, if you talk about the health ecosystem, the pharma companies, and then the Pune labs, they are doing excellent work. Some of the companies have already started work with the Oxford University to basically look for COVID vaccine, and they will be able to manufacture that once the trials are successful. So it's not only government, but the private sector, the companies are also leading in case of Pune. Next slide, please. So that was how the institutional structure is working in terms of response and recovery. In terms of how we should look at next 2 years or 3 years, I think in the short term, the ULBs and the government is planning to open up many of the activities. The entire country and the districts are divided into 3 zones: red, orange, and green. Green zones are ones where number of cases are very less or no cases during last 14 days. So those will open up immediately, but the red zone where still there are few hotspots, it will not completely open up immediately. But definitely there are certain sectors. For example, in case of Pune, there are many IT companies. Most of the employees will start working from home, which they are doing now. So they will work online. So different forums are claiming that almost more than 50% of the employees will continue to work online, especially from IT companies. Even in case of educational institutes, they are adopting online mode. We don't see immediate opening of schools in the month of June and July. Typically, we have a summer vacation in the month of May. So that is also happening. So you can say a lot of digitalization is happening, use of technology as mentioned by Robert. And then the planning aspect, I will come in the last slide. But there is a cascading effect also. There's a monsoon upcoming. We typically have a monsoon from June to September. Where there are challenges because certain areas might get flooding, and as I mentioned earlier, there was an incidence of cloudburst last year only. So we have those memories as well. So city need to prepare for both how to contain the COVID going forward, and also look at other disaster or other shocks the city will face in the coming future. Next slide, please. So in terms of planning for next 3 years, I think there are some aspects which city need to look at. One important aspect is basically decentralized planning. Currently, we have one big APMC, agriculture produce market, in the heart of the city. So city need to look at the decentralization of that. So that is very critical. Decentralization of other economic activities and institutes is also important. Many of the hotspots which I have already shown in the maps are basically closer to slums or actually the slum areas. So city need to look at the informal settlements closely and look at the rehabilitation and redevelopment aspect. There are institutional arrangements in place to tackle that, but city need to push that. The state government also need to push that. One more important aspect is the public health system. Typically, the state and city both have the public health system, but I think the ULBs in India look after the tangible asset, the road and the infrastructure more compared to the health system. But Pune is better off compared to other cities. Still, it has to go one step further and use technology and digitalization to basically address these challenges in future. Obviously, there is a collaboration required. Thankfully, Pune has a very good ecosystem of NGOs and researchers, as it is known as Oxford of East as well. So city will try to basically disseminate more data in future and also involve these partners so that it can effectively manage the pandemic and also recovery part in the coming future. That is from my side. Over to you, Francis.
You.
So actually, I was just going to finish off with one more slide, and with thanks to Mahesh and to Robert. We've covered a lot of ground. One thing I like to say about models is it's really a methodology, a set of thought processes about how to approach a problem. And whether we're thinking about managing the pandemic in the short term, in that 3-week time horizon, 3-month time horizon, or whether we're thinking about the 3-year time horizon, we've made some resources available to this community. So they're all freely available on our website. So if you wanted, whether it's to better understand some of the science of the assessment of pandemic risk to inform a more resilient municipality going forward, you can absolutely reach out to us. In fact, we've created something bespoke for the CROs in this community, which we're calling a cheat sheet. It's essentially a set of self-diagnostic questions that you can be asking yourselves to check whether you're thinking through everything you should be in order to balance this need for public health and restarting the economy. And if you reach out to Robert and me, our emails addresses are on there along with our Twitter handles. We can follow up directly and make some of these resources available. So that's it from me. Next slide, please. Francis, I think you may be taking it from here.
Yes, actually. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Mahesh. A very interesting presentation. There are quite a few questions, in particular for you, Mahesh, here, the popular guy tonight. People asking, for example, what data and where did you get the data that was needed to do the analysis that you mentioned at the beginning of the crisis? And you also mentioned the concept of containment zone. Could you elaborate how were these decided, established, managed in particular, and what particular problem were there in actually creating them and maintaining these containment zones?
Okay, Francis. So I will go one by one. So first question about data is, so Pune city has taken several initiatives in terms of digitalizing its data and also adopting some of the measures like e-governance during last 1 decade. A city has its own GIS map. It's online, available for viewing also. Certain layers are available. At the same time, there is a disaster management department in the city where different officers were engaged in that department during the response situation, where a lot of data was available with the city and a lot of data was collected through surveys. So city conducted something like 30 days of survey during the response time, and they screened almost 800,000 households to basically cover the asymptomatic cases as well. So a lot of this data came from different sources. So one was repository available, other was surveys, then the institutional memory, that kind of a thing. So all was collaborated together to basically come out with a mapping and doing the analysis. Second question was regarding the containment zones. Typically, a threshold was decided on a number of cases. So if one particular ward, so currently there are administrative wards, 15 administrative wards are there. Initially, the wards were taken as area. So each ward is roughly around 300,000 to 400,000 population. And that was taken as a unit where the number of cases were traced and linked to that particular ward. And once the details were started coming out, some wards showing higher numbers compared to other wards, then the city went to sub-ward level where they identified neighborhoods, and then those neighborhoods were completely isolated. So there was a lockdown announced by Government of India, but still certain services, essential services were allowed, for which people used to go out for taking, let's say, vegetables and the grocery and all. But in the containment zone, almost everything was kind of seized, and a police force was appointed there so that there is no violation of social distancing, and it was like a controlled environment. And then further, the corporation ensured that the essential services are provided at the doorstep so that nobody comes out of their home for that. Sorry, I missed your third question. What was the third question?
That was, I mean, what were there particular challenges in managing those containment area? Were people resisting? Were there issues with maybe too many cases in some cases, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I think three important challenges I can say. One is related to overall, you can say the social behavior or a typical mentality, because what happens is people were in lockdown almost 3 weeks. They were not used to that kind of a situation. Then some of the areas are very densely populated, so people used to go out even during the evening and daytime. So that was very restrictive for them. Second important aspect was provision of essential services, because a lot of services or a lot of shops were within the containment zones or outside containment zones, and it was creating kind of a confusion within the citizens. PMC, the Pune Corporation, took a very aggressive step, and they interacted with the community leaders and also ensured that the essential services are actually taken to their doorstep. And third important aspect is, I think, the overall management of different departments. There is a police department which is under the state government, then there is a municipal corporation, then there are private hospitals which were there, then there are government hospitals. I think managing all together with the limited resources, and since this is a very dynamic in nature, you have to respond very quickly. Those were challenges, but city learned over the period of time how to handle those and bring in the coordination.
Thank you, Mahesh. We now have a series of questions also for our guests from RMS, so I am going to put them on the hot seat now. There are a number of questions about the scenario planning, in particular for Robert and Daniel, around how do you think about multiple or cascading crises and modeling those scenarios, whether those be the long-term kind of stresses and impacts that might be related to climate change, or maybe even man-made. There are governance challenges, your neighbor's not managing. How do you think about those scenarios and help cities to develop scenarios at the right scales and for the right challenges? And then related to that, what is the conversation like with insurance? What are the kind of products that are actually sensible in a case like this, where we might have a 1 in 100-year event like a pandemic?
Robert, how do you want to do this? Do you want to take a first pass, or would you like me to? Robert, I think you're speaking on mute, which may be my... Oh, you're off mute now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, so the first question on scenario planning and the complexity of events. So we, as we contemplate the future and actually the extreme events that can occur, we have a choice. We have a choice of either looking at a specific scenario, where we can try and explore a particular event in its full complexity, and in terms of the secondary consequences or the systemic impacts of that event potentially. But at the same time, we need to be careful to avoid getting solely focused on one particular scenario, because the reality is that the future is uncertain and there's a wide range of things that can happen. And that is why the core of our modeling is what we call probabilistic, which means that we model thousands or tens of thousands of potential scenarios and look at how likely those scenarios are, and that gives you this probabilistic perspective. And I talked about the concept of minimizing regret. So minimizing regret is a concept where you really don't know what the future is. This could be a future where you're looking at different factors around climate change, and therefore your strategy has to be that actually you shouldn't just plan against one particular event. I mean, that was rather like the way that some countries only planned against an influenza outbreak. They got a coronavirus instead. You need to work out of a wide range of possibilities. What is your minimal regret of the actions you take when faced with a wide range of possibilities? So it is complicated. I mean, we are modelers, so we try and proceed. We try and work through. We try and model what can happen. So that's Daniel.
Robert, Yeah, I just wanted to add to that before we get on to the question of insurance. I want to agree with everything you've said and also encourage people to think about using a standard format or standard methodology for addressing all types of shocks. So whether it's flood, or whether it's a wind, or whether it's an earthquake, or whether it's a terrorist attack, or whether it's a pandemic outbreak, if you have a methodology which is the same and you are assessing risk on a frequency severity distribution, the methodology obviously needs to be specific to climatology if it's a hurricane, or to virology if it's infectious disease. But if the overarching building blocks are the same, then you can layer in the multiple hazards or the multiple shocks on top of one another and include stresses like climate change or aging infrastructure or urban densification or whatever you want to. And you can therefore begin to see the relativities at different return periods of the impacts of the potential shocks, what's driving it in terms of stresses, and what's going to increase your resilience the most, what's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of investment to reduce the impacts of multiple shocks, because no city is a single hazard city. We all have these multiplicities at play. So I think what Robert says is absolutely right. And if you can if you have a standardized framework for thinking about these things, then you can begin to put a process in place to address them and maybe see synergies across your different responses. Robert, do you want to go with insurance next?
I will try and take insurance. Yes. So I mean, clearly we have not seen a pandemic like this for a long time, and actually, in many areas, insurance products have been developed in response to extreme events. I mean, fire insurance itself was developed in the aftermath of the Great Fire of London, which to the inhabitants of London at the time was a great shock. They had not expected an event like that, and we can see that earthquake insurance and hurricane insurance has developed in the aftermath of extreme events. So we can ask, I mean, in some areas of the pandemic, in some areas around what's called event cancellation coverages, insurance has actually worked quite well in that there has been quite a lot of insurance in place to cover major sporting events or major events, including the Olympic Games, for example, was covered under an event cancellation insurance cover. But there's been much less insurance around to cover disrupted business, either as a result of the original infection or of the actions taken to create social distancing. And there's clearly going to be a focus on that area going forward. Now, in terms of insurance, the challenge is insurance is about diversifying risk, spreading it away, because not all places are going to be impacted at the same time. But in a pandemic, all places are impacted at the same time. So the function, for example, of a reinsurer who insures insurers, the function of a reinsurer to diversify risk around the world for pandemic business interruption doesn't work because the reinsurer can't actually diversify that risk away. So there are definitely challenges around this whole question of insurance going forward. But I believe if the risk can be reduced and if the consequences can be reduced, then there is room for insurance or risk transfer mechanisms, potentially to the capital markets, potentially to pre-existing larger insurers. I believe there is going to be a resurgence of insurance products. It is challenging though because of the difficulty of diversifying this risk away.
Can I just add, if there's time, Lauren, on this very briefly? The diversification point is a very important one. It doesn't mean it's impossible. What that does is just drive cost. When the insurers or the reinsurers can't diversify their risk by geography, then that tends to make coverage a little bit more expensive. The real point I want to make, though, is the question was, what's RMS doing to help here? on the one hand, we're working very closely with insurers to help them understand what their potential exposure is, and also to bring products to market that will be bought, will be useful. But equally, on the other hand, we'll work with municipalities, with corporations, with countries to think about the role of risk transfer in their resilience strategy. And I agree with Robert that risk transfer is only one small piece of your cocktail of responses to risk, but will be an important part. You need to begin by quantifying the risk, and then begin to quantify to what extent you can reduce the risk, as Robert said, by taking action. And then there will be residual risk. And you have to ask yourself, that residual risk, how do I finance it? Do I finance it on my own balance sheet? And that can be a willful choice. You can have a reserve account, or you can just accept that you're going to need to divert some of your operating capital to potential events that may befall you. Or is it more cost effective to use someone else's balance sheet and go to, as Robert said, insurers, reinsurers, other capital markets? But it is a process to think through the risk and understanding it relative to your appetite. And once you've understood that, I do believe if you were to wish to transfer risk into the markets would be very interested in customizing a product to support your particular needs.
Thank you, Daniel and Robert. I think I'll continue the grilling of you two. Robert talked about herd immunity, right? But there actually is no certainty, and I don't want to be too pessimistic here, but there's no certainty we'll have a vaccine within a year or within 2 years, right? This is a very fast shifting virus. We've tried to have a vaccine for other coronavirus and not succeeded. How would you go about modeling this? How would you think about this problem? How would you, to try to assess how long would it take to get to herd immunity, given the policies that will be put in place on social distancing? And then maybe more importantly, what does it mean for the way cities can manage themselves in the medium term until we reach this situation?
Okay, well, I can try and take that. So yeah, I mentioned partial herd immunity, which is that the more people who are immune, the more the spread of infection is suppressed, so that you don't need full herd immunity when the infection effectively is stopped in its tracks, because in every way it was going to spread, there is immunity. So there's this question about, I think there are two questions in here. One is about, if you like, what is the probability of actually of a successful vaccine or vaccines? And clearly, we recognize that this is a probabilistic question. It needs a probabilistic answer, which is, if you like, what is, which we can frame in terms of what is the probability by a certain date in time we are going to have a vaccine, and what is how long is it going to take to be administered to a large proportion of the overall population in different countries. And those are the kind of questions that I feel we can address. I think there is. I am surrounded by some people who are very optimistic on this question. It sounds like you are less optimistic, Francis. But if we weighted different perspectives, I believe we would come up with a reasonable, what we call a probability density function for actually when a vaccine is going to be available, including a tail, if you like, of when it never is available. But actually, I do believe it will be a vaccine. There's so much money hanging on it. If you think of the global economy, and actually, someone has attempted to estimate what is the value of a successful vaccine. The value of a successful vaccine is probably greater than $1 trillion. And with that out there, I suspect there's huge amounts of human ingenuity actually going to be focused on this question. So your other question was about how do cities manage the situation in the absence of a vaccine? I mean, the answer is we are seeing cities actually trying to work this through right now. I mean, case tracing is absolutely critical. Case tracing and testing. I mean, I talked about the fact that most countries started attempting to manage the pandemic using these ancient techniques like quarantine and containment and social distancing. But actually, we have new techniques around case tracing and using, attempting to get cell phones to help in that by identifying the nearest people you've been close to. I just think that this is, again, such a hugely valuable question that actually countries are going to get quite good at managing the situation with the level of infectiousness sufficiently low that people can more or less go about their daily lives. And I think we are seeing some countries getting close to this. Well, we've seen New Zealand, for example, getting right into that spot. We've seen the Faroe Islands, I believe, getting there. We're seeing South Korea is doing pretty well. It's got flare-ups. It's not going to be able to stop having flare-ups. But it is possible to get it down to a manageable level where people can go about their daily lives.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Robert. I think there's time for one more question. We have a number of questions here about data. And so I want to ask this question in two parts, one for Mahesh and one for you, Daniel and Robert. So we have seen a lot about modeling and scenarios. What is it that was the process of making decisions in Pune about how to construct your dashboard and who got access to that? We always hear a lot about, do you have the right data? Do you have it at the right time? And do the right people have access to it? So if you could talk to us a little bit about what that process was like in Pune, and if there was anything you learned that you would keep or not from that process. And then for our colleagues from RMS, what in your view are the best examples of dashboards at a city level for modeling these kinds of scenarios and solutions? And alternatively, what's a minimum viable product for cities?
Yeah, I will take the first question. So in terms of data, I don't claim that is a very robust data which was available, but I think compared to the earlier scenario or earlier situations, a lot of information or the data city gathered together, which was available because city already had a GIS system in place. A lot of ward level data was available with the city. In addition to that, city carried out a lot of surveys, household surveys, so which was like a primary data collected based on the response and based on the changing scenario. So whatever zone turns into the hot zone was surveyed intensely. I think that was also very critical because it was actually giving doing the validation of the things or the decisions they are taking. So that is important aspect, I think. But in future, city further need to work on that because a lot of informality is there in all Indian cities, even in case of Pune, although Pune is better placed in terms of digitalization. But city need to work on that, and a lot of the data is dynamic in nature because India is a diverse country and anybody can migrate to any part of the city. So it's a really difficult job to basically have that kind of a data, but definitely city need to adopt the data science in future to tackle that issue.
I'm happy to respond to the second part of the question, Lauren, and then Robert, please feel free to chime in. So you asked, Lauren, about minimum viable product, what data is required, and where we've seen best practice. You did also ask another question around how to get access to it. Let me just start with minimum viable product. This is what I would say, speaking very personally. You want to know over time the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations, and the number of deaths. And you want to also know how that number over time will change in response to different hypothetical interventions. whether it's types of social distancing or opening up certain sectors of the economy or making a vaccine that's effective, freely available and readily available, whatever those are, you need to be able to see the shape of that over at least a 6-month period, I would say, as a minimum. And I think you need to be having a refresh of that, I would argue, perhaps on a weekly cadence. That, for me, is minimum viable product. In terms of where to get the data from, it's a huge task if you go out and try and collect that yourself. I think we've heard from Mahesh that he's fortunate there's lots of things that seem to be available, but it is a big job to bring that together. There are solutions that are available on the market that use the modeling that has already existed in probabilistic models that Robert was talking about before, and then making them available at the level of cadence that I was describing earlier. So that's what I think is the right approach, because as Robert describes, this is a catastrophe in slow motion in terms of its duration, but it's changing very quickly and updating very quickly. And by the time you get access to new information, the latest information, you're behind again. So I think it's probably worth relying on third parties to deliver that to you. Over to Robert, if you have anything else to add.
One point, one summary point of sort of our perspective on this is that our ambition is to be able to connect actions around human contact, so actions around opening up sectors of the economy, to this incredibly important, the R value, the reproducibility, the transmission of the virus today. So not as it was 3 weeks ago, but as it is today. And the better we can, the smarter we become at actually measuring what actions we're going to take and translating that into what is the impact on the R value today, that is when we are really in control. That is when we have a dashboard which is really powerful for driving our actions.
Thank you all. And I just want to make a larger thank you to you for coming on to the speaker series, Robert, Daniel, and Mahesh from Pune, and sharing with all of the participants this evening. I think you explained very clearly some of the steps that need to be taken for a pandemic resilient city, how to understand risk, first of all, in particular, how all cities are experiencing this particular shock. And then as a second point, learning from how you're managing this crisis, and then actually articulating what you want to do better and sharing that with the market or with actors who can help you, whether they are public or private or NGOs. And then finally, looking into making that risk management cocktail, or if you don't drink, risk management recipe very carefully. So I think we've heard some very interesting approaches, and it's been a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much for sharing. Next week, we'll be back here at the same time. We'll be having Professor Maurice Kugler and the City of Bogota talking about lockdown exit strategies. So please do come back and join us. And as always, we will post the recordings of the session and the PowerPoints on our website. So please do visit us. And if you haven't yet done so, please go on and sign up for the Cities for Resilient Recovery Coalition. We'd love to keep in contact and working together with you. And I wish everybody a good day ahead, or a good afternoon and a good night. Thank you again to our excellent speakers, and thank you to our co-hosts from the World Bank.